He's so obsessed with the Kennedys and the Kennedy name and the Kennedy brand that he caged one and put it in his cabinet, a rabid dog in his cabinet, put a collar on my cousin RFK Jr. and has him there barking, spreading lies and spreading misinformation.
Jack Schlossberg talking about his run for Congress in New York 12. We're going to be talking about Jack today, and we're going to be talking about the Kennedy myth, whether that extends to other kinds of political families. This is the Jack of all trades edition of the Political Junkie podcast. I am Claire Potter.
I am Neil Young.
And we're here today to get back into all things political. We missed last week, Neil. It was all my fault. I'm so sorry. I was traveling around going to my 50th high school reunion.
How was it?
It was actually great.
That's awesome.
And, 50th, all these sort of big deal reunions can be kind of anxiety provoking, just in terms of what has happened to people. And, by the time you're at your 50th reunion, we're all almost 70, and there's a lot of things that have gone down. I went to this all-women's school called the Baldwin School outside of Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it was great. And these women were amazing. And even the events that I thought I really wasn't going to be so crazy about, like there was this lunch where the 50th reunion class was supposed to have lunch with the seniors, the high school seniors. And somebody, I think, had said to them, you've got to ask these women questions about themselves. But they were so poised, and they were so interesting, and they were so polite. They were just delightful. So I kind of left the whole reunion thinking, all is well in the world, when you and I know that all is not well in the world. But for those couple of days, I felt like all was well in the world.
That's great. I think that's not how most people leave a high school reunion feeling.
Really?
For all sorts of different reasons, but particularly good to feel that right now.
Yeah, it really, really is. Well, and having it be an all-girls school, I think, made kind of a difference, because there aren't really a whole lot of spaces in the world anymore that are exclusively female. So it's a real throwback to the past, but also knowing that little bit of the past still exists and is thriving was really quite reassuring.
I didn't realize you went to the Baldwin School. I certainly had some students when I taught at Princeton who went there, so I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, Miss Baldwin School for Girls, Miss Florence Baldwin School for Girls. So There you go. All right, so let's get away from the feel-good stuff and get back into politics. Neil, Donald Trump's approval rating continues to decline. The latest polls that are out this week have him at 34%, the lowest level in his second term. Now, according to Pew Research, one of the steepest declines are responses to the statement, "Trump keeps his promises," to which only 38% of respondents replied in the affirmative, a 5-point drop since August 2025 and a 13-point drop since he was elected. Who is Trump losing ground with, Neil?
All sorts of people. The under 35 MAGA demographic, that has dropped by 30 points. He's lost almost 30 points, like 27 points with Hispanic voters. He's down 14 points with white voters. I mean, just really huge declines across a pretty, wide group of voters. I think just back to this thing about the overall, 34% approval rate, that's just devastating for any White House to be looking at. The 38% of respondents saying that, yes, they think Trump keeps his promises also seems really damaging.
Yeah, well, particularly since a lot of those people who voted for him on the theory that he keeps his promises, which is incredibly naive, because many of us knew, in fact, that it is characteristic of Trump to not keep his promises. Like, oh yeah, I'll save all of the frescoes from the B. Altman building. Actually,
Right.
they're going to end up in a dump in Staten Island. But obviously, the most important promise that he made was not to get the United States into any foreign wars. He has also glibly made all kinds of promises about the national debt, which he, has thrown under the bus. But I think this youth vote and the Hispanic vote should be particularly worrisome to Republicans as we head into the 6 months before the midterms. Talk about that a little bit, Neil.
Absolutely, because first of all, the Hispanic vote, he made really impressive gains among Hispanic voters in the 2024 election. I think a lot of folks were saying, like, okay, this is a promising field for Republicans to really carve out some, big support among these voters that have been pretty blue, pretty Democratic supporting for a while, and to have hemorrhaged those voters so quickly in the way he has is certainly doesn't bode well for the midterms. I think even more among younger voters, though, this has to be really worrying the White House, because there was a moment in time, brief as it was, where it felt like the younger generation was going really conservative, is actually going quite MAGA. And I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that that's still a real trend. But for the decline to happen this quickly shows how weak that connection was for so many voters, and how easily it has reverted. So those, especially under 35 voters, are not high likely voters to begin with. So they were mobilized for a moment. They seem to have become very disillusioned quite quickly. And I don't think that bodes well, again, for, midterm turnout and, Republican success.
Part of what I wonder, and this is what is always aggravating about polls, is there's a specific set of questions and they don't get into the nuanced nitty gritty, as say an anthropologist would be. But it strikes me that there are two factors among the young that are not really being looked at. One is the fact that Turning Point USA has gone from this kind of driving force among conservative youth and youth in general, white youth in particular, and that it seems to be crumbling.
Yes.
Am I right to think that, Neil?
I think it is. I just saw something yesterday, and did it get verified that Erica Kirk was stepping down? That may have just been an internet rumor that was emerging. But whether or not, obviously someone should fact check that before they speak it onto a podcast. But I think more broadly, there is a huge sense that there's a ton of turmoil in this organization, that there's a lot of internal division, a lot of disorganization. There's certainly a lot of folks on the right who are sort of been competitors to Turning Point and to sort of the Charlie Kirk celebrity, that he had, and they're taking this opportunity to sow division because they think that, they can benefit from it. So it seems like a real weakening of this organization that seemed, like not very long to be a juggernaut, and a juggernaut that would deliver like victory after victory for MAGA and MAGA candidates. And already we're seeing like these videos of Turning Point events where no one's in the audience.
Right.
There's one like at the University of Georgia a week or so ago that you would think would be fertile ground for Turning Point, and nobody was there.
Right. Right. No, I have seen those. And the other thing that I wondered about Turning Point, and we're wandering a little bit from Trump's popularity, but I do think this matters in terms of mobilizing the youth vote. Yeah, because it was Charlie Kirk who had the organization that got kids on the ground, not just to turn out each other, but to turn out older people. And he did a really good job of that. I wonder two things. One is whether Turning Point USA was really kind of a cult of personality. Once Charlie Kirk is gone, there's really no there. The other thing I wonder is that in the wake of his death, there was a lot of talk about Turning Point expanding really rapidly, and a lot of Republican politicians getting behind it. Ron DeSantis was saying he wanted a chapter of Turning Point in every single high school.
Right.
I wonder if that kind of rapid expansion has also made it a weaker and more diffuse organization.
Probably, and a lot of that rapid expansion was sort of being driven by this reaction to his murder and this huge upswell in public sentiment, understandably, around that. But like a response that is about sort of tapping into the political fervor isn't the same thing as like actually building an organization on the ground. It takes time and structure and investment and real thinking, and I'm not sure that those have been the actions taken by these folks as much as, again, they were just using it sort of opportunistically to like grandstand around, you know, the terrible events of Kirk's murder. But I do think there's also a ton of reporting that shows that there's just real inner turmoil and real you know, sort of organizational chaos happening that obviously isn't benefiting the organization as well either.
Well, and you wonder how much of that organization Charlie Kirk just carried around in his head.
Right.
You know, he was an extremely energetic person. I think neither you or I are fans, but we have to acknowledge that he was extremely effective, built a good organization really rapidly. And to what extent, I mean, you really saw this in some ways, you know, going back decades with the welfare rights movement. After George Wiley died, really, it's not that the movement went away, but it fragmented into different groups doing different things in their local areas. And Turning Point USA has always relied on its localness, its campus-based quality.
Yeah.
And that's also a weakness when it comes to a moment of transition. Just as you're saying, people can't agree what to do. The other thing I wonder, and this is totally unscientific, I have no research on this, Neil, but young people have really short attention spans. And you kind of wonder whether being mobilized around Donald Trump, around that brand, around the sort of social activity of supporting Trump, whether at a certain point they're all just like, okay, you know, next, please. I mean, there's really nothing in a Trump administration that is benefiting young people.
Right. I think that's a big part of this. And, you know, I think especially when there's not a coherent policy agenda or really a sort of core commitment to like, policies and principles, but a cult of personality, or rather a personality that sort of seems to tap into energy and momentum, like that energy and momentum can find a different outlet really easily. Right? I mean, especially right now in, you know, a social media, digital, you know, moment in which like everything is competing for our attention. I think young people are particularly susceptible sort of to the newest thing. And it feels like that's a bit what's at work here as well. Like, are 19-year-old kids really getting excited about a midterm election? Probably not. Probably not. It's hard to get voters in general interested in that. So, and if you don't have a coherent force like Charlie Kirk was, I mean, Charlie Kirk provided a lot of coherence and thoughtfulness to a movement that was led by a completely incoherent, unthoughtful person, right? In terms of Trump. Like, Charlie Kirk did a lot of work of translation and of sort of holding together something that like is hard to hold together given the person at the helm. So his absence is profound, I think, especially among, you know, young people who are not all that inclined to be that interested in politics to begin with.
I totally agree. And the other thing I would drop in before we move to our next news item is the virality of his YouTube clips, which not only reached lots of young people, but they reached lots of older people too. I mean, my brother-in-law, who's a Trump supporter, has watched all of them, and he was very impressed by them, and he was very drawn in by Charlie Kirk. Well, you know, he's my age. And so I think Kirk had a way of sort of knitting together generations. And I think one of the things we've seen, and this just has something to do, I guess, with what's being covered in the news, but the many, many young Republicans clubs who seem to be treating the Trump presidency like an opportunity to throw a sausage party. And they don't seem like very serious people. They're just like a lot of young men in suits trashing people on the internet. I don't really see what they're doing to build any kind of MAGA movement for the future.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next news item is that Trump's popularity among diehard Republicans is still enough to quash dissent in the party, at least in some places. On Tuesday, the primary in Indiana saw 5 of the GOP incumbents in the state legislature defeated by Trump-backed candidates. And I think 2 of those races are still hanging out there with a very slim margin.
Yes.
And a recount. And some observers have noted that Indiana is one of the last states where the contest between the MAGA Republican Party and a GOP establishment has still dominated the political landscape. Neil, does Indiana telegraph anything about what's going to happen in 6 months?
I don't know, because I do think, first of all, this is an important race to look at and to, as you say, note that, like, Trump isn't always toxic, right? Like, he isn't poison in every situation. But what are the situations that we're talking about? This is a internal fight within the Republican Party over, like, which candidates or which Republicans voters want to represent them. In a place like Indiana, the establishment figures being kicked out of office by MAGA folks. I mean, in a way, it just sort of condenses in one example what we've been seeing happening for several years across the party, across the country. So I think that this is just a very condensed version of what's been happening for actually the decade that Trump has been a political candidate, and this internal battle of, like, what the GOP is. So I think, Trump's folks can feel good that apparently he had the magic touch in this place, but what is the bigger, what's the bigger takeaway from this for them in terms of the fall? I don't think that there's, like, a way to say that these results suggest a different outcome for the midterms than what every poll has indicated is going to be a pretty strong showing by Democrats. I think if voters come out who are not the GOP base, an election plays out really differently. But who's coming out for a primary in Indiana to determine, Republican candidates? It's the hardcore base.
Yeah, I think everything you're saying is right, Neil. And, one of the things that I neglected to introduce this with is to say this is all about the redistricting campaign.
Right.
And that Indiana's Republicans, initially, these 7, held out and voted with the Democrats to not pass redistricting to conceivably hand every single congressional district over to Trump. The other thing that is important, I think, is that they had to spend $13.5 million on this. The world where we are spending millions of dollars on state legislature seats is a world in which that money is not actually going to the congressional campaigns that they have been meant to establish. So I think it remains to be seen whether this trade-off of Trump sort of reaching in and punishing people at the state level is sapping resources. And in Indiana, it's not going to matter. Indiana has gone Republican since the beginning of time,
exactly,
I think.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, do you know that Indiana in the 1920s had more chapters of the Ku Klux Klan than any other state in the Union?
I did know that. Because I had to pass my...
Because you had to do your rolls too.
Exactly,
So
yes.
listeners, pay attention to that. Indiana is actually the South, even more so than, say, a border state like Pennsylvania. There are all these border states sort of running along between North and South. And Indiana is a place where white supremacy, anti-Catholicism, and anti-Semitism flourished in the 20th century. So there is this very long history of being friendly to reactionary movements in Indiana. But what was actually important is that they had a governor who was Republican who was saying, no, this is not good for politics. This is not good for the party. So it strikes me that there are alarm bells going off in the Republican Party if people like 7 state legislators in Indiana and the governor of Indiana are saying no to Donald Trump. If in a place like that, they're saying this is going to be a problem, then actually I think we should be paying attention.
Especially when you consider these results in terms of what we just discussed, which are Trump's abysmal poll numbers. I mean, this logic makes sense when your president is at, above 50% or close to it. And he's a popular president. And for whatever reason, he's pushing the party in a different direction. And there's holdouts that, wanted a different version. And it makes sense that people who are sort of stuck to the past are replaced by, folks more aligned with the president. But as we've just said, this is a president who is wildly unpopular.
Right.
And yet it is the kiss of death for elected officials to speak out against him. That is a logic that doesn't make sense, but it is it is the way that things are operating right now in American politics.
Well, and you said something earlier, Neil, that I want to emphasize, which is this was a primary. And we all know, we have repeated it on this podcast over and over again, that primaries are for the zealots. They're for the activists. Everybody else sort of wakes up at 4:00 on primary day and says, really, there's a primary? So it'll be interesting to see if destabilizing these districts, and I think probably what they're going to do is, take places like Indianapolis and break them into 4 and dilute. So it's a pack and crack system. But as we said before, this destabilizes the system within which local politicians are working. So it'll be interesting to see if it matters even in a place like Indiana. All right, so our final news item for today is continuing this theme. Yes, we're seeing MAGA making a little resurgence in Indiana. You can have Indiana Donald Trump. No one else wants it. But places where MAGA has dominated in the past 10 or 12 years or delivered surprise wins for Donald Trump in 2016 seem to be becoming vulnerable. The Democrats have added 8 more candidates to the 36 they are targeting in a campaign they are calling Red to Blue, targeting vulnerable districts and running strong candidates in them to try and flip a Republican seat. Those seats are in California, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Maine. Sounds perilously close to what Howard Dean used to call the 50-state strategy, Neil. And then what's happening in Ohio?
Well, we have post-primary polling, and so Vivek Ramaswamy, who's the Republican candidate for the governorship, he is facing a really tough race against the Democrat candidate, Amy Acton. I saw a poll this morning that had Amy Acton at 53%. Wow. Also in the Senate race, former Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown is within striking distance of the Republican incumbent, whose name is John Husted. So I think, again, we've talked about this, I think, a couple of weeks ago. Ohio used to look, and for a while has looked really, really red, solidly red, huge support for Trump. And so these Democratic numbers in the state of Ohio are really, really remarkable. I'm actually going to be in Ohio in 2 weeks visiting my in-laws, so I'll maybe can do some reporting on the ground to tell you how many, Democrat signs I see up in the middle of Ohio. But I think not long ago, folks were saying Ohio was just a state that Democrats had lost, and they weren't going to regain any time. So for them to be in striking distance this quickly again, I think speaks to, again, the bigger challenges that Trump is creating for the party across the nation.
Yeah, and is Amy Acton, I should have looked this up before we recorded, but is Amy Acton another one of the female candidates who is also a military veteran?
I thought that she was a military veteran.
All right.
That's
all
my
right.
memory.
Yeah, I think she is too. And then the other thing is Vivek Ramaswamy is really not popular in the Republican Party for a variety of reasons. One is he's kind of a strange man with strange physical and verbal tics and so on. But it's also the case that he has been specializing in being one of the cautionary voices within MAGA. So there are a lot of MAGA influencers who absolutely detest Vivek Ramaswamy, who worked really hard for him not to be nominated. And then in this other race, of course, Sherrod Brown was the senator from Ohio. He lost, I believe, who did he lose to? No, not J.D. Vance, because Husted is in the Vance seat. So Sherrod Brown lost by a couple of points. He's coming back against John Husted, but Husted has never won a statewide race. In Ohio, he was appointed to replace J.D. Vance. And Sherrod Brown is just a monster campaigner.
Yeah. And I think, obviously a huge name in the state of Ohio and, very well regarded, although he did lose his seat in the last time he was up. I think back to Ramaswamy, I all of those things I think are absolutely at work here. He's sort of awkward in a lot of ways and a little bit weird in terms of a lot of his public presentations. That said, I also think that there's probably racism at work here as well.
Right.
Which, you hate to see, and certainly shouldn't be the reason that folks vote against him. There's plenty of reasons not to, but you do wonder in a state as white as Ohio, someone named Vivek Ramaswamy and the way he looks, if that is also chipping away a couple of points for him.
Yeah, and whether actually people just won't come out to vote. That will be actually the interesting thing, is Republicans saying, well, I can't vote for a Democrat, so I'm just going to stay home. I'm not going to do this. And the thing is also, Neil, that we should bring back into this is Ramaswamy is not only the target of racism, he has also come out very strongly against the Trump administration's policies on HB1 visas.
Yes.
And so there is a
H-1B.
specific kind, H-1B, sorry. So there is a specific kind of racism that he's being targeted by, which is this animus toward Indian Americans,
right,
who are perceived by many white MAGAs as taking the things that should go to white people.
Right.
All right, so let's make the turn to the political race that we're really going to focus on today, Neil, which is New York 12, otherwise known as the Silk Stocking District. Used to be just the Upper East Side. It was considered to be a liberal Republican district. It was the district that powered someone like John Lindsay, for example, Nelson Rockefeller, and so on. The Silk Stocking District now extends from the Upper East Side across Midtown and then up into the Upper West Side. Yeah. But it is the richest congressional district in the nation.
It is? I didn't know that.
I looked it up, yes.
That's actually really interesting. This is my former district, which doesn't mean that I was contributing to the richness of it. But, as you say, it's a huge portion of Manhattan. So for a good chunk of the 20 years I lived in New York City, it was in the New York 12. But yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. I would have maybe imagined some like carve out of Silicon Valley might be the one, but perhaps they're not able to draw the lines in a way that only capture, Atherton's money.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me. I would say, actually, Neil, you do strike me as a silk stocking kind of guy. And if you haven't gotten there yet, we have to work on it because you deserve it. But Jack Schlossberg, now he is but one of the candidates. There were 36 Republicans running in this primary, and there are something like 20 Democrats. But the ones we really care about are George Conway, a former Republican dirty tricks operative who was married to Kellyanne Conway, and then they had to get divorced because George Conway turned on Trump. So George Conway is running as a Democrat in this district. Alex Boris, who I believe was the chief of staff, is it him that's the chief of staff to Gerald Nadler? Who
I think that's right.
And, yes, who has been in the seat for years.
Yes, and he also has served in office in New York, and one of his biographical one of his selling points is that he's the only elected official to hold a computer science degree.
Yep.
In the state of New York. So that's sort of his calling card.
So that's really interesting. And then there is Micah Lasher, who apparently was a magician as a child. And he's a Yankees fan. He's also spent his entire career in politics. And then there is John Kennedy Bouvier Schlossberg. And how do we know Jack Schlossberg? How did we know him before he started to run for Congress, Neil?
Well, I think in one way we know him simply because of that last name and the way that sort of we know the extended family of Kennedys in ways that are sort of remarkable for just like how this family like looms in the public imagination. But like him more specifically, he really in the last couple of years had made himself into a pretty well-known social media influencer, TikToker. He had a gig writing political commentary and putting those in quotation marks for Vanity Fair. I mean, he had this moment as a sort of media /
Yep.
social media darling, or at least, celebrity in the ways that one can be in the digital space in these days. There's a big question if he would have been any of those things were it not, again, for that last name. I mean,
right.
If he's just another white guy TikToking, like, I'm not sure in fact, I know he doesn't get a political correspondence job for Vanity Fair without that last name, but here we are.
Right. And he is John F. Kennedy's only grandson.
Right.
Okay, so he's the only male direct descendant of John F. Kennedy. His mother is Caroline Kennedy, who I've always liked and admired, and I will probably say that a million times during the show. I think she is one of the most dignified, decent people on the political landscape, and we'll talk about her a little bit. But Jack Schlossberg, you're right, the TikTok thing, and he has actually been credited with developing the sort of combative style, somewhat derived from MAGAs, that has then been adopted by people like Gavin Newsom. So there is a piece of Jack Schlossberg that, as a politician, he seems to get the zeitgeist, but the question of whether he is qualified for the job is something that I think we need to discuss today, and what it means to be qualified for the job. Yeah. But let's go back to what you were raising, Neil, which is this Kennedy legend. Something that exists across the political spectrum. The Republicans seem to always want to be owning John F. Kennedy. There's many people have said that the reason Donald Trump wanted his name on the Kennedy Center is he wanted to be associated with John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy legend. The QAnon conspiracists believe that JFK Jr., who tragically went down in a plane in the 1990s in Martha's Vineyard, they believe he's still alive and that he is going to return. And there was some thought at one point among the QAnoners that he would become the vice president, that J.D. Vance would be forced to resign, and JFK Jr. would become Trump's vice president, so that this legend would be married in their own minds. And then, of course, there's RFK Jr., who jumped into the 2024 race, and I think, played a big role in Trump getting elected, and sort of mustered all these Maha moms as swing voters. But Jack Schlossberg isn't the only Kennedy who has run for office. There's lots of them that are associated with political life, right, Neil?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been so many Kennedys who've run for office. A lot of them have served as well, obviously, as we know. I mean, think about Jack's mom, Caroline Kennedy, ambassador to Japan. She also had her own short-lived run for the New York for Senate. Kerry Kennedy has run a major human rights organization. Was formerly married to Andrew Cuomo. Maria Shriver, of course, the television star, and I think a well-regarded media figure, and then of course was married to Arnold Schwarzenegger for a long time. Lots of Kennedys, sort of in all ranks of public service, nonprofit leadership, and sort of on and on.
Yeah, I mean, the Kennedy name is associated with public service when it's not being associated with Marilyn Monroe or something like that. But the idea that Joe Kennedy Sr. had, which is that he would make all this money, and he had a terrible reputation. He was a bootlegger, he was a womanizer, range of things, and he basically pumps money into his son's political campaigns. So one after another, Jack Kennedy becomes president, Robert F. Kennedy becomes his attorney general, and then he becomes a senator. Ted Kennedy becomes a senator. The idea that Ted Kennedy is going to become president sort of becomes very real after RFK Sr. is assassinated. Yes. So there is this sort of stew of ambition and public service and tragedy associated with the Kennedys. One of the things I read the other day, I didn't include this in our readings, but they don't really have that much money anymore. Like when you have that many children, the fortune becomes incredibly diffuse. So that there are a great many Kennedys out there that the only capital that they have for running for office is their name. That's probably not true of Jack Schlossberg. I think his father is a very well-regarded designer. Yeah. I think Caroline inherited a great deal of money from her mother, who was married to several very wealthy men, and then did very well herself, was a very shrewd and intelligent woman in managing her own affairs. So I think Schlossberg probably does have his own money. I have noticed that one of the things he's saying is that he's not taking any super PAC money.
I saw that too, yeah. That stood out to me.
Yeah, which suggests to me, but he isn't talking a lot about, this is a campaign run on small donations and kind of thing. I do think, now he was recently endorsed by Nancy Pelosi, and Pelosi has an awful lot of money at her command, and it's not super PAC. There's this other kind of PAC that congresspeople and senators have where they can dole out money to their friends. It's a whole different thing.
Super duper PAC.
Super duper PAC, super secret PAC. And Pelosi has always been famous for having that kind of money at her command. Right. But I wondered, Neil, what did you think when Pelosi endorsed Jack Schlossberg? Because it seems like, on the one hand, his message is a new generation has to take over. On the other hand, here he is being endorsed by, one of the oldest members of Congress. Does that seem odd to you?
It seems odd to me, but it also isn't that surprising either, because it just feels, my sort of cynical read of this is like, this is how powerful people operate. They help other powerful people, right? And so this is a Pelosi nod to the Kennedys, and with whom I'm sure there's been probably lots of connections through the years as sort of, power players in this party, especially over the history that she's been involved in. And so, I don't know how close Nancy Pelosi is to Caroline Schlossberg, but I imagine there's some sort of affinity there, and it feels like this is what it's about. It's, I think, listen, there's nothing embarrassing left in American politics, so it would be wrong for me to call this embarrassing, but when we have the person who's in the White House, but it just feels a little, especially as I think we'll talk about, when this candidate has no real policy message. I mean, if you look on his website, it's like a set of principles, which are things like courage and creativity, which are great qualities to have just as a person in general. But like, that is not a policy platform. He's clearly running on his name, on name recognition. And honestly, maybe who can blame him? If the job is to win the seat, and you can do so based on, you know, people knowing who you are, then I suppose you don't really have to come up with a set of policies that you believe in. That's one thing as a candidate. It's another thing for, you know, someone like Pelosi to then say, okay, you're the one who gets my endorsement.
Right. And, you know, just sort of going back to the Kennedy legend for a minute, because by coincidence, we watched the Ryan Murphy series Love Story, which is terrible. Have you seen it?
I haven't, because that's what I've heard mostly, and I can only do so many terrible Ryan Murphy series.
I know, and some of them are more terrible than others. And this one is actually extremely terrible. It has scenes in it like Jackie Kennedy, as she realizes that she's dying of a brain tumor in her beautiful apartment, listening to the soundtrack of Camelot, which is like something she never would have done. I mean, I don't even know her, but she would not have done that. I mean, I don't think the Camelot thing was kind of a branding gimmick. I don't think she was still thinking about it in 1992.
I'm sure not.
It really not. But the other part, and I do think every once in a while the show plucked out a major theme that is useful, is that the idea that Kennedys always operated in the interests of the public, that they were always ready to serve, ready to stand up. And of course, we know that put an awful lot of pressure on an awful lot of them. I mean, drug addiction is a theme in the Kennedy clan. It's not just RFK Jr., but also that there's particular pressure on the men. Like, at what point are you going to run for Congress? At what point are you going to run for Senate? Now, one of those Kennedys, Joe Kennedy III, I think, is a congressman from Massachusetts. He's a great kid, really great kid. I think, I mean, I call him a kid. That's because I'm 67 and he's like 40. But he was a student of Elizabeth Warren's. He's a really good congressman. So there's a lot of them that have gotten in and done really good jobs. But it seems to be like the thing that they're always waiting to do. And you kind of wonder whether they want to. I mean, is Jack Schlossberg's inability to really settle on any kind of a real career by the age of 35 not similar to JFK Jr.'s inability to settle on any kind of a career by the time he was 40? Because the thing that's supposed to happen is you're supposed to run for office.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pattern we see happening over and over again in this family. So it has to feel like there's something there to that. And also, as you say, there's, you know, maybe not the great fortunes that there were, you know, 50 years ago, but there is still some sort of family money that makes the urgency of like gainful employment, you know, not like what it is for the average American. But, you know, you also just wonder, like, I mean, you hear about these families where, like, you know, 3 generations, 4 generations of men have been, you know, doctors, or they've been lawyers, or they've been pastors. And like, of course, the next son is going to do that thing. How much more must it be hard to develop one's own way when the family that you know, grew up in are the Kennedys, and it's not just a sort of internal family history and a sort of, you know, self-fulfilling tradition at work, but it's like an expectation from almost everyone in the country that if your last name is Kennedy, then that means you're probably not going to like get an engineering degree and work at like, you know, a civil engineering firm, or like, you know, go to med school, or any sort of like normal thing, quote unquote normal things, but that, you know, one is by dint of that last name sort of foreordained to go into politics.
Yeah. I mean, I think this idea of the Kennedys as somehow this simmering royalty. I mean, I noticed recently that the Shah of Iran's son, who actually I think calls himself the Shah of Iran, even though they were thrown out. He's been sort of popping up all over the place. Like, once the regime falls, the Shah of Iran is ready to come back. I mean, there is this kind of weird attraction of Americans for having our own royalty at the same time as people are resentful of elites. And I don't actually understand how those two things go together.
Yeah.
Do you?
It's been the real conundrum of the last decade, right? Because it's really become sharpened in the rise of Trump. And, a person who is fueling his political momentum and his political movement on this anti-establishment, anti-elite rhetoric and energy, and at the same time, is gilding the White House in fake gold and sending out memes showing him as a king, and his supporters gobble it up. Mm-hmm. And in fact, like, polls show an increasingly high number of Republicans saying things like, they don't think we need to have a democracy anymore, and it might be better if we were ruled by a king. And of course they mean if that king were Trump. And so those seems to be like real contradictions, but they make sense in a world in which I think what a lot of folks are looking for is not so much as a leader as a sort of savior, and that Trump has positioned himself as such. So I don't know. I mean, I think that there's always been some desire in America for a sort of noble family, and right. The Kennedys held that for a large portion of the 20th century. It seems a lot of that energy and that enthusiasm has now been transferred to the Trump family.
Right. No, and it's interesting because unlike, say, the Vanderbilts or the Carnegies or the Rockefellers, those families made their money in industry. And because of that, they were the object of tremendous resentment by working class movements, and became responsible. The Rockefellers were responsible for burning down an entire tent city of striking workers early in the 20th century. But the Kennedys, because Kennedy made his money on bootlegging, it wasn't as toxic somehow, and it remains somewhat sub rosa or something. But I want to get back to this whole question of why Americans are attracted to this, because it seems like certainly if we think about the Trumps as like this new Kennedy legend, and that really has been an effort by someone to portray them as the new royal family, the new dynasty, that Americans seem to be more interested in the idea of a political dynasty than they are interested in politics. And I wonder if the Schlossberg candidacy is in some ways a kind of democratic example of this, because, you ask Jack Schlossberg about policies or problems and how to address these problems, and he really doesn't know how to talk about it. And it's much more. And the guy is not Trumpian in any ideological sense, but it's much more Trumpian than it is an example of the kinds of Democrats that we're seeing, the Mikey Sherrills, the Abigail Spanbergers, the Wes Moores, who can give you 2 or 3 sentences about this is what we need to do about housing tomorrow.
Right.
So there is this kind of dynastic attraction. How is that playing out with the Trumps? Let's just sort of put this in play a little bit.
Like how are the Trumps sort of tapping into this opportunity of political dynasty? I mean, in lots of alarming ways. If you're, folks like us who don't like any of this, but Don Jr. is being touted far too often than I like to hear as a potential 2028 candidate. I mean, I honestly just cannot believe that, but it just seems to be mentioned all the time, and like there's some real steam gathering there. Also, like there was this effort to put Trump's son Barron onto the stage back in 2024 as a Florida delegate. Then there's this, I think, pretty frequent talk about Ivanka and also Trump's eldest granddaughter, Kai Trump, being, political candidates in the future. Ivanka was sort of bandied about a lot in terms of running for some sort of position in Florida. And honestly, I could see that. But it feels like this family has hitched their wagon to America's, to mix a metaphor here, to like America's political trough, because there's clearly, real financial incentives here in the way that the Trump family has pursued this. But like, I don't think the Trumps are going away is the takeaway here. And how self-consciously they're molding themselves in sort of a Kennedy tradition, I think is a question. Like, clearly not in terms of the politics, but I think in terms of like this idea that they can tap into an American psyche that seems sort of predisposed to granting certain families a political dynasty. They seem really attuned to that.
Yeah, the Kai Trump thing was the one that really shocked me when I just started
Completely.
like Googling everybody's names, and all these things came up that said Kai Trump says she's not interested in a political career yet. Well, she's 19 years old.
She's 18. She's a senior in high school.
Right. She's attending the University of Florida.
University of Miami. She's a golfer.
Oh, University of Miami. Okay. Mm-hmm. Sorry about that. Go Neil.
Big difference.
Yeah, big difference. And she is a professional golfer.
Right.
Apparently a terrible professional golfer, but a professional golfer all the same. And so imagining such a person as a political candidate, I mean, the only reason for that would be that she's Don Jr.'s oldest kid. But also there is this kind of yearning for a politics that is more symbolic than real. I mean, remember that Joe Biden was imagining his son Beau as a future president. Mm-hmm. That, it was really, he was really just going to be a placeholder for Beau. And then, of course, Beau died tragically of a brain tumor. But there was a long period, too, where the idea that the Democrats could be saved by a Michelle Obama candidacy was being floated around. And I kind of feel like people are losing their minds. It's like all they can see is the brand. They can't actually see the work that's going into politics.
Yes, and I think a lot of this comes down to like just being like, who can win? Who can win for my side?
Yep.
And it's not surprising that a lot of Americans make that calculation via things like fame, celebrity, recognizability. Because honestly, you look at political coverage, right? If you watch the political, like if it's MSNBC or CNN or Fox News in the evening, what are they talking about? They're not talking about policy. They're talking about politics. They're talking about what's the horse race? Like who's the horse that's going to win? And so I think Americans have had a media ecosystem create a sort of political circus, as opposed to something that like thinks deeply about policy and how politics actually affect people's day to day. But it's not surprising in this 24/7 news cycle, social media, digital world that we live in. I think that what people seem to be drawn to is, names they recognize, and this idea that certain people from certain families can be the ones that, they get their side the win.
Yeah, and that somehow, something in the American spirit will be revived if we put another Kennedy into office, that we can just reach back to 1960, to all that sort of hopefulness, that pre-Vietnam moment, before the civil rights movement became the Black Power movement, when liberalism was the vital center, blah, 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 that somehow if we just like get a descendant and lock them in, that can happen. All right, so let's talk about Jack himself. He was born on January 19th, 1993, which happens to be Nancy's and my gay anniversary, which is a little weird. Anyway, born on January 19th, 1993, the youngest of three children. Jack's sister, Tatiana, died of leukemia late last year. She was the one that published that really moving essay in the New Yorker that talked about her illness, but also became a platform to criticize RFK Jr.
Yes.
And the Trump administration for destroying the nation's research infrastructure. The third sibling is Rose, who is an artist and filmmaker. She lives out your way, Neil, in Northern California. Jack has a completely elite education, the collegiate school, Yale and Harvard Law School. He has mostly worked as a writer, although in the interview with Katie Couric, she says, what have you done in your life? And he said, well, I passed the New York bar. And I'm like, that is, I know it's hard to pass the New York bar, but that is, in fact, a low bar for work experience. He has been exposed to politics as a Senate page and an intern, but had very little experience actually doing politics. He's worked on campaigns and so on, but he hasn't actually worked as an aide to a senator or congressman. He's dabbled in acting, writing, and nonprofit work. He's never practiced law, as far as I can tell, and he's really most famous for this big social media presence. I did notice when I looked him up on Wikimedia Commons to get some illustrations for this post that there has been some concerted effort to get a lot of pictures of Jack with Obama, Biden, Hillary Clinton. I mean, there's a library of these pictures of Jack standing next to iconic figures in the Democratic Party, often with his mother standing there too. And he's also taken up a lot of the work of the JFK legacy, the Profiles in Courage Awards, public stuff with the library, and so on. So he has built this platform as, don't forget, I am John F. Kennedy's only grandson, and they mention it constantly. But let's talk about his mother, Caroline, who I have also said previously in this podcast, I really do admire the woman. What has been her role in politics?
Well, I think it's more of a role sort of behind the scenes as a kingmaker than, a politician herself, right? So, yep. I mean, it feels like almost ancient history at this point, but it's highly relevant in that, right. Like in 2008, she endorsed Barack Obama. She wrote a New York Times op-ed titled "A President Like My Father," and that was really, really an important moment. I remember what a huge media sensation that piece made, and sort of the fact that Caroline Schlossberg had chosen Obama over Hillary. In that race, she also, actually, speaking of Hillary, she briefly ran for the Senate seat that Hillary Clinton vacated in 2009 when she became Secretary of State. But she actually ended up dropping out of that race pretty quickly because, and I'm not sure if it was because of this, but at the same time, her Uncle Ted Kennedy was diagnosed with brain cancer like right after she launched her campaign. It's really interesting to think what would have happened if she'd stayed in that race, because I think most folks at the time thought she was going to win, and that's obviously a completely different trajectory for her if she'd become the junior senator from New York, and one could imagine her being in that role for as long as she wanted to be.
One can, and yet, as you were sort of hinting, Neil, it's hard to imagine her really being able to stick with the the very public nature of campaigning. I mean, she has always been someone, and the Ryan Murphy thing makes a big thing of privacy, privacy, privacy.
Yeah.
I don't actually think that's who she's been. She has been a very public-facing woman, and she has done a great deal out there. You're right about the Obama stuff. I mean, it was really Caroline who said to Ted, Obama is the future of the Democratic Party, and you need to get behind this. So it was them working together on that. And I'm sure she works the phones. She constantly appears at the DNC, but campaigning is a whole different thing.
Completely, yeah.
And also spending all that time raising money. I mean, politicians spend about half of their workday raising money, and it's very, very hard for me to imagine Caroline Schlossberg doing that. But
yeah. And just you say public facing, and I think that's absolutely right. But those are public facing acts on her own terms, right? And as you say, to run for office and to then be beholden to donors and for so much of your life to be about fundraising, I think she's probably has spent a lot of her life fundraising, but in the way that wealthy people do, sort of for causes they care about, which is different than being out on the campaign trail, asking donors to donate for you. I mean, that's that feels really different from from being like a kingmaker, from being a person who can pick up a phone and call influential Democrats and sort of make things happen just by, the power of who you are and what your last name is. Feels like a different thing than picking up the phone and asking, New York Wall Street billionaires to support your political campaign. Both of it is sort of fundraising and seeking, to tap into influence to get things you want, but that feels a little bit different when it's like you, the candidate, asking for people to write checks for you.
Well, and in a way, it is also something that Jack Schlossberg is far better positioned to do.
Yes.
Because at the age of 35, having attended collegiate, Yale, and Harvard, he has gone to school with dozens of men and women who are now partners in big firms. And, he can place half a dozen calls in the morning and probably rake in $100,000 is my guess. I mean, I know people who work in the nonprofit world who have degrees from Yale Law School, and one of the things that buys you is a list of donors. It's not that going to Yale Law School is not good for you in a range of ways, including, some of the things you have to do when you're running a nonprofit. But in fact, it puts you in a position to call some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the country and their children and get them to contribute to your campaign. So in a way, Jack is better positioned for that. Now, it looks like, in addition to being photographed a lot with important politicians that sort of hinted at his future, that he was starting to get worked into the rotation. In 2020, he spoke at the Democratic National Convention. It was actually him and his mother, and I believe they were in Martha's Vineyard or something. They were up against a gray shingled wall doing a video feed thing. So he spoke at that, and then he spoke alone on his own without his mother in 2024. And that's kind of a coming out moment for potential candidates, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a great stage to announce yourself on, to be made visible. Certainly, Barack Obama did very well by his, early DNC appearance. And so, it's a plum spot to get, and obviously one that was very well timed for, this race.
Yeah. And okay, so let's talk about him. I don't know, did you have time to watch some of the film? It's a little painful, and
it is.
part of what's interesting to me is, as I said before, he's having difficulty articulating who he is as a candidate. The campaign rollout was kind of rocky. As you said, his issues, as articulated on the campaign website, seem kind of vague. But what struck me most, Neil, is that the kind of energy and pep and sort of improvisational character that he is on Instagram and TikTok just disappears when he's in a formal interview. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, he becomes like a flat version of himself, or you know, and who's to say what the real version of a self is, or even if one only has one version of themselves. But you know, when you first, I think as many of us did, encountered him on like the TikToks where he's like dancing and being wild and often shirtless and being coy and even sort of campy at times. And then he's doing these interviews and it's like he's become sort of this serious, like almost vanilla person talking about, you know, how he wants to restore American democracy. It feels a bit like a disconnect. I mean, there's another way to interpret this to say like, well, he's being appropriate in the spaces that he's, you know, like to be on TikTok is to do one thing. To decide to run for Congress is to like, you know, behave a different way and to sort of treat those differently. I think I was a little, I mean, I think he definitely doesn't have a real policy agenda, as we've said. He's definitely running on an anti-Trump message, which is not a bad message to carry to voters in 2026. It's also worth remembering what his district is. It's the Upper East Side. It's the Upper West Side. It's what you just said, the richest district in America. So him offering himself as a person that's famous and has the last name Kennedy and like is hearkening back to things like Obama and his own grandfather, and like that's his candidacy, that works to get elected in New York 12. I think we'll find out. And so, you know, it's, again, I don't think it's surprising that he's not coming forward with like a bolder policy agenda. We only know about this though because of who he is and the fact that he's getting interviewed by people like Katie Couric. If he's running for like Iowa 12 or like California, you know, Nevada 14, you know, and doesn't have a famous last name, he doesn't get any of those national interviews like most congressional candidates don't. So, you know, on one hand, I think you started with the question at the top of our show, like, what does it mean to be like what does this job require? And like, what should like a candidate really have in order to run for Congress? He's under the microscope that like no one else is. And so that doesn't mean he shouldn't be able to answer those questions, but I do think it is to sort of, you know, the two-sided this two-sidedness of the knife or the sword that cuts both ways here is sort of how fame both benefits him and may, you know, subject him to sort of scrutiny that like the average candidate doesn't get.
Yeah, and I worry about him on the debate stage, both because he seems very scripted. You know, it's kind of like you drop a penny in and talk. Although there were moments in which, in the Katie Couric interview, which I'm actually going to put in the newsletter, listeners, Katie Couric sort of picks up the ball and runs with it and starts talking about policy and as if like, come on, can we get some of this policy stuff out here? But the interviewer should not be doing that. The other thing is he does have one policy that he talks about, which is that it is unfair that people who own their homes get tax deductions and people who rent their homes do not get tax deductions. And I was listening to this and thinking, well, what exactly is wrong with this picture? And one of the things that's wrong with this picture is that part of the tax deduction that people who own their homes get is property taxes. You get to deduct your property taxes. Why? Because it's unconstitutional and against the law to deduct the same, to tax the same money twice. Right. And that's the whole basis of deducting that. Okay. So that doesn't account for mortgage interest, that you can take your mortgage interest. And that is definitely an incentive for people to buy. Fair. But it's also the case that how does that work? That people get to deduct part of their rent from their taxes. Why would that be something that genuinely affects affordable housing? Would that not be something that incentivized landlords to raise the rent? Right. You know, so he sort of has this little policy that he throws out, but he doesn't actually seem to understand the implications of that policy Or maybe he does, but he doesn't seem able to talk about it. So let me ask one more question before we go to our viral things, Neil, is where did we get the idea in the first place that being elected to Congress required special training and experience?
Well, I mean, I think it's not a crazy expectation for voters to have. I mean, I think, it's a good thing that people have, or for a good portion of this country's history, had some sort of expectation that, someone would prove themselves, actually usually through having run for other offices, served at the local level, or made a career for themselves in the fields of law or, business, and using that sort of expertise and background and experience to make a claim for why they should represent constituents in a large district.
Right.
I mean, that seems like a sort of baseline expectation. I think the bigger question is like, why has that gone away for so many voters?
Right. I think that's interesting. And then you look at someone like Graham Plattner, who is doing even better than he was before in Maine because Janet Mills dropped out.
Right.
Graham Plattner has never held political office, and he's running for Senate. And yet Plattner seems to be able to speak to issues in a, normal, forceful way that I'm really missing with Schlossberg. So it seems part of what worries me about him is not that he doesn't have political experience, but that he doesn't actually have much experience doing anything. Whereas Graham Plattner can say, all right, I was in the military. I know how to do this thing. I ran an oyster business. I really understand a lot of things about small business. And it's not clear to me, like, okay, you were a correspondent for Vogue.
Vanity Fair.
Oh, Vanity Fair. Okay. Well then. Well then. Anyway, I wish the young man well. I will not be voting in this election as I vote in Massachusetts. But I do have one final thought, which is that it might be easier. You were saying that Schlossberg is appropriate for the setting he's in. I was thinking about someone like Elizabeth Warren or Maura Healey or Katie Porter, who sort of went the opposite direction. They knew how, they had a persona as a politician, and then they figured out how to put that on social media. Like Elizabeth Warren is great on Instagram and TikTok, but she's the same person she is talking in the well of the Senate.
Yes, yeah.
And maybe it's harder to go in the other direction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we need to wrap this up, but I would suggest that's not the case on the right. I think Republicans are finding that is a pathway that works very much for them. Yep. But I do think this raises real questions about, like, what it means to be a politician in the Republican Party versus one on the Democrat, and sort of what works for candidates of either party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. All right, well, we're going to keep our eye on this one, Neil. Now let's flip to what we want to go viral this week. What do you want to go viral this week, Neil?
Well, what I want to go viral is this wonderful book review about a book that I really want to read. So we'll make a plug for the book as well, but I haven't read the book. So this book review is a great overview of it, and I think makes some really profound points that perhaps the book itself doesn't. So the book is called, let me get the full title here, Lab Dog: What Global Science Owes American Beagles. It's by the historian Brad Bowman, who I believe is at Tulane. This book came out last year from the University of Chicago Press. It's sort of been on my long list of books to read, but this article at Public Seminar popped up on my feed about a week or so ago. It's a review article, and it's titled, What is a Beagle? And the subtitle is, In Lab Dog, Brad Bowman probes how the beagle became such a popular subject of American science and such a potent symbol of American patriotism. And basically, like, I don't know if you've seen this, but beagles have been very much in the news in the last couple of months, because there's all these different things happening around scientific research and animal testing. There was this big, I think it happened maybe in Michigan about a week ago, 150 beagles were rescued from this, I believe it was a pharmaceutical testing plant, testing facility. And there was just incredible videos of all these volunteers carrying the 150 beagles out. And
we should have been there, Neil.
I know, they're all being adopted. And so anyway, it's very much in the news right now. And so this book and this review article are highly timely. But one of the things that's particularly interesting that's relevant to our conversation is something that apparently is a sort of concluding theme of the book that this review essay spends a lot of time thinking about, which is how this push to end animal testing has become a component of the conservative hardliners' playbook against science in this country. And so, you know, you may have noticed that there's a lot of far-right figures out there these days, like Laura Loomer and Paul Gosar, who are like, and even Ann Coulter, who are like all over this like anti-animal testing thing. Like they're really pushing it. And, you know, it's like one of those things where you're like, okay, this is the rare moment where I find myself aligned with someone who otherwise is completely crazy, because who doesn't want to protect animals? But as the book and this piece points out and really explores, it's not actually about protecting animals. It's about, you know, this broader assault on science, on scientific expertise of vaccines and all the rest that we know is sort of a much more insidious movement on the right. And beagles and sort of animal testing become this sort of smokescreen for this sort of political cause against, you know, the American scientific establishment and you know, scientific expertise itself. So we'll link to this really nice review essay and public seminar. The author of that is Erin Niebuhr. And like I said, this book, Lab Dog by Brad Bowman, is also something I'm going to be checking out really soon too.
Fantastic, Neil. You know, I have to tell you a brief story, which is many years ago, about 15 years ago. Nancy and I were taking a vacation in the Keys, and we were at this little bed and breakfast and sitting around the table one morning. I don't know why we were talking about animal testing. Maybe it was one of these things, but this woman sort of like really teed off on how terrible animal testing was, and it shouldn't happen, and it should be made against the law. And I thought, oh, you know, as rarely happens in Florida, I have found myself among friends, even though these are strangers. And then somebody else at the table says, well, how are you going to test these things? And she said, well, I think they should be tested on prisoners. And I thought, whoa, no. And so that, you know, what you're saying sort of locks into a way in which a love for animals, in some ways the same, a care for children, care for fetuses, blah, 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 becomes associated with the ability to sacrifice other things, like science. Neil, thanks so much. That's fantastic. So what I would like to go viral this week is an article that I was just fascinated by Amelia Tate in the New Yorker. It's called Are Disney Adults the Happiest Debtors on Earth? And it's about adults ranging in age from like 19 to 60 or 70 who take on tremendous credit card debt to go to Disney spaces, Disney World, Disneyland, Disney Cruises, Disney Europe, blah, blah, blah. And what Tate is writing about is that Disney sort of creates this holistic ecosystem in which you could also get a Disney credit card to finance your Disney trips, right? So they create this holistic ecosystem that people, adults, retreat to, and that it is a kind of refuge from a very ugly world, and a refuge that is resonant with childhood. Sometimes it's the childhood they never had. Sometimes it's the childhood that they want their own children and grandchildren to have. But that there is, you know, there are thousands and thousands of people who go back to Disney over and over and over again. And by doing so, incur a massive amount of debt for these vacations. And Tate talked to some of them, and they said, well, you know, I realized that coming home from Disney with $7,000 on my credit card that it then took me 2 years to pay off was not a great idea. So the next time I went, I made a very strict budget for myself. And then they go to Disney and they just get involved with the whole thing. And there's so much Disney you can buy and so much Disney you can consume and so on. And it makes them so happy that they just keep spending on it. And apparently it is a real economic phenomenon of people being driven into debt by going to Disney. There are people who take these Disney cruises and, you know, as cruises do, they stop off at various locations where you can get off and do excursions and so on. They don't get off the ship because they think that breaks the magic of Disney. And all these people, they talk about magic all the time, that it's this magic world that you can become immersed in. My guess is Amelia Tate is writing a book. There's a book that she cites in this, but the idea of Disney adults spending money on Disney the way other people take on debt to, say, go to college or buy a house is apparently a real phenomenon in the economic world. So that is Amelia Tate, Are Disney Adults the Happiest Debtors on Earth, in the New Yorker, May 2nd, 2026. And that's all I got, Neil.
Wow. As someone who was born and raised in Orlando, you know, and who has been to Walt Disney World more than 100 times in my life, although rarely as an adult.
100 times, really?
Yeah, that's my cocktail icebreaker. Is what cocktail party icebreaker is. My one weird fact is I've been to Walt Disney World more than 100 times. But again, 98% of those times were, you know, before the age of 18. So anyway, long way of saying I'm very eager to read this article I've been seeing a lot of people talking about. So we'll check it out soon.
Well, you know, I almost never fly through Orlando when we go to Florida, because we go to the west coast of Florida, the Tampa, St. Pete area. But for some reason, we flew in and out of Orlando at one point, and I remember getting on the plane to come home, and we were the only people not wearing mouse ears.
Yes. I mean, hello. Like, my entire adult life living in New York City, every single time I flew home, to see my family, I was like, I'm the only person on here that's not, blinged out with Disney stuff. And you're either going down to Orlando and all the kids are like out of their mind, excited and screaming, or you're coming back and they're worn out and exhausted and crying, and their parents have just spent apparently themselves into debt. And it's a terrible, terrible, terrible plane ride.
We should develop like a podcaster theme park. That's what we need. And so we're going to be working on that before next week. And I will see you next week, Neil. Have a good time.
Credit card offer is coming.
Credit card offer is coming. All right. See you next week.
See you then. Bye-bye.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Sparkling Eyes by Afternoons. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.